Welcome to our grief series. I'm Christy Bundakumara, psychiatric nurse practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience, but my experience in grief is personal. I've lost a total of 3 children over 17 years, and I'm still standing, which makes me an expert. Today, I am reviewing a book called the Grief Recovery Handbook, and this was actually recommended to me by my psychiatrist from the Amen Clinic where I got a PET scan. So I read the book. These gentlemen, John James and Russell Friedman, actually have a grief website with lots of information. They also teach courses. I think that overall, it's a good book. I am going to go through some of the pieces. Their theory is that all grief, everything is grief, every single loss, which I agree that every single loss needs to be grieved, but there was a little kind of stretch of it for me. So John James actually went through a divorce and talks about that as a loss, and Russell Friedman had a stillborn child, so lost a child. Their theory is that all loss is an incomplete relationship. Completely makes sense. He never was able to meet and really bond with his stillborn child. I have lost children, and it feels incomplete as you think about my relationship with my children. And that definitely is why, or what feels like, the symptoms that we are experiencing. It's this incomplete relationship. Same with divorce or the loss of a husband. What you thought that relationship was going to be is no more, right? And needing to kind of complete that relationship. So in this grief recovery workbook, that is kind of the overarching theme, that all loss is an incomplete relationship. And even, kind of talks about like trauma and trust, and even trust in God. So if you follow me, you know that I teach the Mentally Strong Method. This is something that I developed. But as I'm reading this book, I'm like, yeah, but the goal is different. We do need to process trauma. It is a real loss. And I encourage people to put that in the grief category. But trauma also needs to have some sort of integration or disintegration where it's not significantly impacting your life. So working through completing that relationship. So in this book, they're talking about all loss is an incomplete relationship, and the actions that you take are to complete that loss or complete that relationship. So for example, if I were talking about my children, then I would, do some of the activities, which I love the activities. They were very useful, and definitely think this is a good read for someone experiencing some grief. And I think the activities help you to kind of complete that relationship here on earth, right? And, for me, I feel like it is a continuing relationship, that there is life after death. And I can still be kind of connected to my children. So my relationship with my children is not complete. So, and again, sometimes this is a play on words, right? Like sometimes I just don't like the wording that someone uses when they're talking about their grief theory. And that's fine. And that's why each and every one of us are on our own grief journey. Read as many books as you can. What triggers you, what doesn't work for you, you let it go. But you learn from each of these things, right? And relationships are a priority. I truly believe that. I believe that relationships are eternal. And so talking about all loss as an incomplete relationship makes sense. And we need to do some activities, some rituals. I've talked about that. All of the grief theories talk about doing some action in order to go through this grieving process. One of the things that I really liked or learned from reading this book was they were talking about how we learn to grieve improperly or in an unhealthy manner. So think about your first loss. Maybe you were a child and you lost a pet or a dog. What did your parents do, right? They said, "Oh, honey, don't feel bad." And, maybe you talked a little bit about the dog will be in heaven with us later, or maybe there was some conversation around that grief, but it was probably short-lived. And what do most parents do? They go buy a new puppy. They go replace the loss. So we learn, don't feel bad, replace the loss. We also learn that time heals all wounds. So often, if we try to continue talking about that grief, our parents, our support system, our loved one says, just allow time. Time will heal all wounds. So we learn that this grief, we need to do it alone. We can't do it in a group. We can't do it with other people because people keep trying to distract us. They keep telling us, don't feel bad. Replace the loss. Time will heal all wounds. So we think that grief has to be done alone. And so we learn that at a very young age. And so as you get older, maybe there's, kind of known losses throughout your life. Everyone will have loss, right? You break up with a boyfriend, your friend moves away. These are normal losses, and those things might work for normal losses. And then something happens that is intense grief. And you try to revert to these learned behaviors in your childhood. And it causes hardship, dysfunction, depression. Because in intense grief, it is so hard to grieve alone. The negative thoughts come up. There's so much that happens when we are in a bad place and we are alone. So, that's one of the things that I really learned from reading this book. I do think using the mentally strong method, putting things into different categories, because that negative self-talk is not about this incomplete relationship, right? That's something I should be changing. That's something that I probably have been doing prior to grief, right? Is, talking negatively to myself, blaming myself, saying that there could have been something I could have done, or whatever it is around your grief. Also, spiritual conflict, lacking a trust in God or your divine yourself, wherever your spiritual connection is. I believe that severe loss causes a spiritual conflict. They talk about it in this book as a loss of trust, and therefore it is a loss, and therefore you need to grieve that loss and complete your relationship with God. So they do mention the kind of spiritual conflict that occurs. To me, it's a little different than grief. Yes, it's a loss of trust. I lost trust in God to protect me, but that, for me, it's a spiritual conflict. I'm going to wrestle with God. I'm going to go within. I'm going to meditate. I'm going to do things specific around that spiritual conflict because my spiritual health is important. And it's, yes, in grief, you want to have an eternal belief system, but your spiritual relationships are in its own category. We want to work through those things and, find our truth. So overall, I think it was a good book. It had some really good activities. I think It's important to find activities that work for you. And so I do recommend the Grief Recovery Handbook. Continue following me as I review grief theories and other grief books. I believe that we can be mentally strong even in the midst of intense grief.